There are different theories about what triggered the transition to agriculture, whether it was flooding into the North Atlantic from a huge glacial lake that stopped the ocean currents and triggered a mini ice age, or asteroid strikes are a theory, massive volcanic eruptions are another theory, but something happened around 12,000 years ago that created a situation in which there were too many people and the climate changed in a way where there wasn't enough food for them anymore. And in previous times, when this situation arose, people have done what animals have always done when the climate shifts in a way that reduces the availability of food. A lot of them died. For some reason, in this case, roughly 12,000 years ago, people figured out how to change the environment rather than to die off and adapt the population to the carrying capacity of the environment. They increased the carrying capacity of the environment. Maybe it was by digging irrigation trenches from a river to the trees that were wilting because the rains had stopped. Maybe it was taking some seeds from some wild elkhorn grasses and planting them along the banks of the river where they had access to water and they could flourish. There are lots of different ways it could have happened, but in any case, what happened was people started controlling, manipulating the environment in such a way that they got on a wheel that we've never been able to get off. Because once you start doing that, once you're adapting the environment to a growing population rather than reducing population to the environmental constraints, you're in a ratcheting cycle where the population continues to increase and you keep making more and more dramatic changes to the environment in order to feed that population. So that's a radical change in the relationship between human beings and the environment, and that has eventually led us to where we are today, where we're at the absolute limits of the capacity of the environment to continue feeding a growing population.
I'm gonna stick this inside your shirt because we're getting a little bit of wind.
Okay.
So was there any noise?
It was mine.
Was there any like the crackling? Okay. And you're still not getting up, right? Okay. So what's, in a nutshell, what's wrong with our current civilization, and what's wrong with the society that has built it?
In a nutshell. In a nutshell. Well, you know, I think that the essential flaw of modern civilization goes right back to the origins of civilization, which is the notion that rather than changing the way we live in response to natural constraints, we change nature in order to make the natural world accommodate us, accommodate what we want to be doing. So global population exploding, for example, and we respond to that with more and more innovative farming techniques that take the accumulated fertility of the soil and use it up faster than ever, dumping more and more phosphorus in, using fossil fuels to grow more and more food that's less and less nutritious and healthy for human beings. So what's wrong with modern civilization and the people behind it is, I would say, essentially an arrogance, a refusal to recognize that we're part of the natural world and that we cannot keep bending the natural world to our will. That in fact, ultimately, we're not angels, we're animals, and we have to function under the same constraints as other animals, no matter how clever we are.
Are you adjusting the shot? Oh, never mind. Okay. So how has modern civilization, unreal civilization, in general, embedded hierarchy and patriarchy into itself.
These get dark in the sun. Is that a problem? Keep them on?
No, keep 'em on.
Keep 'em on.
Yeah, it's okay.
All right. Well, patriarchy was a part of civilization from the beginning. When you look at how hunter-gatherer societies are organized, women have status almost always in almost all hunter-gatherer societies that I'm aware of. Women have status equal to, or in some cases higher than men. Women, in fact, bring more of the daily calories to the group than men do. Hunting is high status, everyone likes barbecue, so when the men go out and hunt and they occasionally catch something, it's a big party, but day after day, women are digging up tubers, finding berries, finding insects and rodents, and they're doing the real bulk of the work of bringing daily food to the people. So because of that, because women know how to take care of themselves, they know how to build shelter, they know how to fend off animals, they know how to do everything they need to do, they're not dependent upon men in hunter-gatherer societies. If anything, men are more dependent upon them because, as I mentioned, the women bring in more of the calories. Also, women give birth, men can't give birth, so that gives them something that the men need. But generally what you find is in hunter-gatherer societies, very strong tendency toward egalitarianism. Anthropologists refer to this as fierce egalitarianism because it's fiercely defended. No one will put up with anyone else telling them what to do, despite the arguments of Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins and other people who seem to think that some alpha male character could come into a hunter-gatherer group and dominate and impregnate the women and eat all the food and not do anything. That's not how hunter-gatherer societies work. A character like that, a Donald Trump kind of character, would be banished or shot in the back. Because remember, hunter-gatherers have been armed with deadly weapons for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So I don't care how big and strong you are, you get an arrow in the back, you're done, right? So there's a very fierce egalitarianism built into hunter-gatherer groups. What happened with the shift to agriculture is that women went from being co-equal to men to essentially having the status of domesticated animals. They became breeding material. They became possessions of men. So when you look at the Old Testament, for example, which is largely a document about the transition from hunter-gatherer society to farming, if you read it in that light, you'll see lots of information about this, how difficult this shift was. You read the passage that says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife," and most people read that. I always thought that was an admonition to respect your neighbor's marriage. But if you read it in context, it says, "Nor his house, nor his ox, nor his slave." So his wife is just another possession that your neighbor owns that you should not covet. So it's not about marriage, it's not about the dignity of a relationship or intimacy, it's about property rights. And so women became the property of men, and men became obsessed with the sexual behavior of women because for the first time they were concerned with who was going to inherit their accumulated wealth. Right? Hunter-gatherers have no accumulated wealth. So who cares who the biological father of any given child is? It doesn't matter. We're all related. We're all interrelated. We all share our resources. We all take care of each other. So why should I care if you got pregnant from him or from me? It doesn't even matter. And in fact, many hunter-gatherers don't understand that one sex act can result in a pregnancy. So there's no reason for them to be concerned about these things. But once you shift into agriculture and men start accumulating resources, they build shelters, they accumulate land, they have herds of animals, domesticated animals, then they start to become very obsessed with female sexual behavior as a way to assure their own paternity so that their wealth is being passed down their male line.
What about systems of hierarchy in terms of how does civilization in a way have to be organized around hierarchies rather than anarchy, which most people think of as, big and scary people are gonna knock down my house. is in a sense a lot. It's a lot more like direct democracy.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a question of scale, that when you have a certain number of people trying to live together, it becomes impossible to have a society that functions in an egalitarian way. There has to be top-down hierarchy because people don't know each other, and reputational damage is no longer an effective way to control behavior. In a hunter-gatherer society, for example, if you were to go out hunting and shoot an antelope and you didn't bring it back and share it with everybody, word got out that you were hoarding food, that you were holding out on the rest of the group, you would be ostracized, you'd be ridiculed, people would be making fun of you. And if that didn't work, then as I said earlier, you'd be banished and or killed. So you don't get away with anything in a hunter-gatherer society because everyone knows each other. And so your reputation is extremely valuable and can be damaged by any bad move. When you get into a society like the modern world, where we all have to function and interact with people we don't know and will never see again, then reputational damage is no longer effective, and then you need systems of social control that don't depend upon knowing people and intimacy.
That can be done in post.
Okay, that was my feeling. I just wanted you to have the option to. Okay.
We actually almost touched this earlier. Okay, so
You're doing well on the soundbite there.
Oh, good.
You are.
It's not my first rodeo.
I know.
Humanity created civilization, but are we evolved to live in it?
I sometimes wonder if humanity created civilization or if civilization created humanity. Michael Pollan, in one of his books, talks about how it seems that we have cultivated wheat, but from the perspective of wheat, they've cultivated us. Wheat has cultivated humans because we've spread the seed. We've been a great advantage to wheat from a genetic perspective. If that's how you look at the success of a species, there's far more wheat around now than there was before people. Same thing with chickens and cows and, name your crop or domesticated animal. Similarly, I feel sometimes that when you look at this relationship between humanity and civilization, if you look at civilization as an organism, I can see how civilization has benefited, right? It's grown, it's spread, it's wiped out any competing social systems. It's become extremely strong in a military sense, an economic sense. It's an unstoppable force. It's even taking over the natural world, and maybe will spread to other planets, which is extraordinary. But when you look at humanity, have we benefited? Has the average person benefited? Now, everybody listening to this is going to say, well, come on, man, we have antibiotics. Sure, we have antibiotics, but most of the things that antibiotics cure, and by the way, they're almost at the end of their curing ability, most of the things that they cure, the tuberculosis, didn't exist until agriculture. Cholera didn't exist before agriculture. Chickenpox, smallpox, name the biggest killers of humanity. None of them existed before agriculture, before we were living in close proximity to domesticated animals, and those bacteria, those pathogens jumped over from those domesticated animals. All of the major killers of humanity are results of civilization. So when people say civilization has brought us modern medicine, I say, who gives a shit? That's like you're running up to my house with a bucket and I'm supposed to be grateful when you lit the fire. You lit the fire in my house. I'm not going to be grateful for you showing up half an hour later with a fire truck. That's the effect of modern medicine on civilization. Most modern diseases and other ailments not considered diseases, like heart disease, which, okay, got to edit that. Heart disease isn't a disease, but we call it a disease. All right, I'll start. So most communicable diseases, infectious diseases, are a direct result of agriculture, and other ailments that torture human beings, cancers, heart disease, anxiety disorders, depression, suicide. These things are almost unknown in hunter-gatherer groups. Even tooth decay. People will say, oh, modern dentistry saves us from so much suffering. Hunter-gatherer people don't have cavities. They don't have dental distress. So yes, airbags are a wonderful thing, but don't tell me how airbags are so great and helped would have helped our hunter-gatherer ancestors who didn't drive cars. That's essentially the relationship there.
Okay. So could you discuss the idea of corporations and civilization as a whole as kind of a superorganism?
So something happens to certain kinds of organisms when they reach a critical mass in terms of absolute numbers or in terms of population density, where they start to behave very differently. So if you have salmon, for example, swimming around in the ocean sort of randomly, and they all, I think it's after 7 years, they start to go back toward the rivers that they came from. When they reach a certain density, they begin to school, and then they move in unison, right? So the fishermen will wait to the point where they begin to school. They'll get inside that point so they can catch more of them together. If they go outside of that point, then they're just swimming randomly and they won't catch them. So we see this in fish that school. We see this in murmuration of starlings, these beautiful flocks of starlings that, you know, dance in 3 dimensions in the sky. We see this in herd behavior. We also see this in insects and anthills. If you have 20 or 30 ants walking around on a tabletop, they're just randomly bumping into each other, but you get a certain critical mass of ants and they start to form a colony. Everybody specializes and knows what to do somehow, even though there's no explicit leader. It's an emergent property of these social organisms. And my belief is the same thing happens with human beings. When we were at a lower population, absolute population, and also population density, we behaved differently. We were egalitarian. Women were co-equal to men. We were sharing, not because we were noble savages. We shared because that's what assured our survival. That was the best way of mitigating risk. It was no more noble than paying your auto insurance now. It's a way to mitigate risk, spread it across the population. So sharing food made sense because I don't care how good a hunter you are, you're not going to get something every day. Maybe today I get something, tomorrow you get something, we share. And what are you going to do anyway? There's no refrigeration. So you're not going to take half your antelope and save it for next week. In Africa, there's an expression my wife told me years ago. The best place to store extra food is in your friend's stomach. So that was sort of the operating principle in hunter-gatherer societies. Now the population has reached a density where we begin to act differently, and we have, I think, become a superorganism that is functioning according to its own agenda. And it's an agenda that really has very little to do with the well-being of its members. So an example is there's a species of grasshopper in North Africa that in fact, the name in Latin is gregarious. So they're friendly. They are dispersed. They eat grass. The rains come. The grasses increase. They reproduce really quickly, so the population of grasshoppers increases because of the abundance of the environment. Then the rains stop, the grasslands start to diminish, and as those grasslands diminish, the grasshopper population becomes more and more densely packed. And there's a point where that population density triggers epigenetic changes in the in the grasshoppers that result in rapid shrinking of their front legs. Their back legs get longer. And this is individual grasshoppers, not over generations. I'm talking about one organism. The coloring changes, the shape of the head changes. It's got the same DNA it was born with, right? But now it's become a different animal and it starts to act differently. It becomes cannibalistic. They start eating, they start biting each other. They become desperate and they start to swarm. And this is the swarm, the plague of locusts that's mentioned in the Old Testament. That's this creature. It starts off peaceful and dispersed, but a time of abundance creates higher population, and then the abundance stops. Restriction in resources creates greater population density. Epigenetic changes happen, and it behaves as a totally different creature. I think that's what's happened to Homo sapiens as well.
So how does consumer culture and a society that is of consumption, how does that impact us and the planet?
Well, I think the underlying premise of consumer culture is that the world is here for us to consume, right? I mean, we call it consume. We don't call it borrow, right? We don't call it take what you need. We call it consume, take it, destroy it. Consuming is it's not a cycle. The word to me doesn't suggest a cycle. It suggests finality, right? And so consumer culture not only, I think, contaminates our relationship with the natural world in the way that it tells us, like the Old Testament, that the world is here for us to use, right? Apparently the Old Testament God said, I put these animals here for you to use. I put these plants here for you to use. Everything's here for you, you amazing human, you amazing animal that's different from every other animal and better. This arrogance that underlies our relationship to the natural world is reinforced by consumerism. And it will redound to our total destruction, of course, because as we consume, we leave nothing in its wake. We leave waste. We leave topsoil that's washed away into the oceans and killed the coral reefs. And the natural world can't withstand our consumption. And at this point, with a population of 7.5 billion or whatever it is, I've lost track. I used to remember how many people are on the planet. It changes so fast now I can't even keep up with it. So I think the fundamental problem with consumer culture is that it encourages a totally false and destructive relationship between human beings and the natural world.
Why do you think that people the majority of the population is failing to take drastic action to change our ways in the face of climate change, the sixth extinction, in the face of how we're so obviously killing ourselves? Why do you think that the majority of the population is kind of believes it, but they aren't doing anything about it?
You know, I think it's one of the misunderstandings of hunter-gatherer society is that our hunter-gatherer ancestors struggled to survive, that they were always at the brink of starvation, that they were in states of constant warfare. This is the neo-Hobbesian narrative of prehistory, is what I call it in Civilized to Death. And it's part of what I call the narrative of perpetual progress, because the idea is for things to be so wonderful now, they had to have been really horrible back then. This is wrong. Things aren't so wonderful now, things weren't so horrible then. It's wrong on both sides. In fact, hunter-gatherers rarely work more than 15 hours a week. And by work, I'm talking about activities that we would consider leisure activities. Hunting, fishing, walking around with your friends, picking berries in the woods, right? These are things we do on weekends. This is considered work by the anthropologists who study work patterns in hunter-gatherers, and they find that even these activities only occupy about 15 to 20 hours max in a week, right? The rest of the time they're sitting around telling stories, laughing, taking naps, relaxing. They have time to think about stuff. Most modern people, despite 10,000 years of unrelenting progress, most modern people don't have time to think about stuff. They're working their asses off. They're working 40, 60, 70 hours a week. Not only people struggling to pay the rent, but also wealthy people. People in Silicon Valley take pride in working 70 hours a week. Lean into your work stress. It's absurd from a biological perspective and from a health perspective, but this is the catechism of modernity, that you need to spend all your time working. So if you're spending all your time working, when do you have time to sit back and think about big picture questions? Like, what's really happening to the planet? Like, what should I be doing to change the trajectory of history? So I think that's one thing. I think people just don't have time. They're running and they're desperate just to get by. I think the second thing is that people don't feel that they have an impact. Half the people in the US don't vote in presidential elections. Now, part of that's because it's inconvenient, intentionally so. It's, election day's not a holiday in the US, and so people are working, they can't afford to take time off to vote. I think it's very similar, right? A lot of people don't participate in politics because they're just too busy. But I think a lot of people could and don't participate in politics because they say, my vote doesn't matter. Who cares? And similarly, why should I recycle? If I recycle, is that going to save the planet? If I don't eat tuna and I eat, whatever sustainable fish instead, is that going to save the planet? I think people feel they're on a train that's headed for a cliff, and changing where they sit or putting on a seatbelt isn't going to change what happens to the train. I feel that way.
So what about generational amnesia?
Generational amnesia, or also known as shifting baseline syndrome, as I understand it, is the idea that you believe that the world as it was when you were a kid is the natural state of the world, and so you only see the degradation that happens in your lifetime. I think that's part of it. I was a kid growing up in Western Pennsylvania. I used to go out and catch frogs by the stream, and the environment was pretty polluted in those days, in the early 70s in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, but there were frogs in the streams. There are no frogs anymore. But kids grow up without frogs, they don't notice the difference. They don't notice the absence. We don't notice the absence of things we've never experienced. So I do think that's an issue, certainly on a cognitive level, but we have science, we have documentaries, we have lots of evidence that's there, if you want to look at it, that shows the degradation of the natural world, the shrinking of the glaciers, the shrinking of the fisheries, and so on. So I don't know that, from my perspective, the generational amnesia is as much an issue as a sense of apathy and powerlessness that's cultivated by the scale of the problem.
How does the need for a job in today's society, in a sense, enslave us to having to work or be living on the streets begging for a nickel?
Yeah, I've been looking at this issue of guaranteed basic income, and I find it amusing that there's so much resistance to it, and people talk about the dignity of work as if, people who talk about that have never worked in a fast food outlet or pumping gas or gutting salmon in Alaska, all jobs I've done. There's no dignity in any of that work. And I think that part of the resistance to universal basic income is precisely that it would give people the option of opting out. And once you opt out, if you can survive, even if it's $1,000 a month, you can survive. You can live in your van, or live in a yurt or something and have a garden and some chickens. You can certainly survive on $1,000 a month. But the problem with that is, then what are you going to do? You're going to think, you're going to talk to your friends, you're going to learn things, you're going to become a pain in the ass to the system. You're going to become subversive and potentially dangerous. So if you want people to be subservient, you keep them in suits and ties, shaving, getting up before their bodies want to. You break their spirit a little bit every day and keep them running. Keep them worried about the immediate concerns of, how am I going to pay for health care? How am I going to get my kid into school? How am I going to pay the rent next month? If you're thinking about that stuff, you're not thinking about revolution.
How does traditional education act as a pipeline in that sense, for in a sense, preparing people for the rat race and trying to make them feel like that's normal?
Well, traditional education in the United States is designed around making factory workers, right? That's why the bell rings to tell you what to do. That's straight out of factories. There are no factories anymore. All the factories have left the US, but the educational system is still churning out these factory workers who can't find jobs. And if they do find jobs, they're paying a third of what they paid 30 or 40 years ago, when you could actually raise a family with one income from a factory job. Those jobs are all gone. So what do we end up with? We end up with men feeling emasculated, blue-collar men feeling emasculated, disrespected, and a lot of that, I would argue, is expressed in explosions of violence. So I think that a lot of the shootings that we see, a lot of the racism that we're seeing that's increasing now under the Trump administration, a lot of that is fueled by the frustration of blue-collar men who aren't able to find a decent, dignified way to make a living. And I think the educational system is designed to perpetuate a world that doesn't even exist anymore. I think it's primarily functioning at this point to break the spirit of kids, and where they refuse to have their spirits broken simply by being disciplined and all the sort of conventional tools of suppression. Now we've brought in pharmacological assistance, so we drug the kids. I think 25% of boys in American schools are currently being drugged into subservience and submission. So it's pretty clear to me that the educational system is not designed to create critical thinking. It's designed to encourage subservience and mindless following of rules.
What is the fundamental flaws of neoliberal capitalism?
Of what?
Neoliberal capitalism.
Well, what do you mean by the phrase? It's used so much.
What would you say if you could boil down to I guess the few very, very basic issues that are just at the heart of the current model of capitalism and civilization, what would you say those are?
Well, I think probably the biggest sort of revolutionary change in the last 20 years in an economic sense has been around globalization, which seemed to happen under the Clinton administration pretty largely, which was in the 90s. And the promise there was that everyone was going to get richer, which didn't happen, of course, because the factory jobs that I mentioned earlier that existed in the US, the auto manufacturing, the steel plants, those all shifted to China, Latin America, Southeast Asia, where labor's a lot cheaper. And so labor unions in the US were undercut. They had no leverage to negotiate salaries and benefit packages. So you saw a massive dislocation of American labor, and the middle class basically was destroyed in the United States. I think previous to that, what was being sold to the American public was trickle-down economics. This was in the 80s. This was the Reagan administration arguing that if we cut taxes on the wealthy, there would be more jobs for everyone else because the wealthy would then cycle that money back into the economy and create jobs, build businesses, and so on. That didn't happen either. This is all lies. This is all just lies that rich people tell poor people in order to extract more of their wealth. I had a job in New York City for a while. I worked for a millionaire there, and he traded stocks all the time. I remember he told me one day, when the stock market's booming, get out, because the stock market is just a way for the rich people to steal the money from poor people. So the stock market starts booming, everybody puts their money in the stock market, rich people take theirs out, the whole thing collapses, and then it starts again. Cycles of economics. So I think that the essential flaw in modern economics is the idea that wealth is created for societies or for countries. But the fact is that Exxon is not really an American company. Exxon doesn't give a shit about America. The only relationship Exxon has with America is that the CEO of Exxon becomes the Secretary of Defense so that he can make sure that the US military, which is composed almost entirely of poor people, will be sent to defend the interests of Exxon. So I think, to me, nations are like sports teams. We all think, you're a Packers fan, I'm a Steelers fan, but the fact is that the Packers and the Steelers are all paid professionals. They don't care. They're just doing their jobs, getting paid very well. And the people who own those teams, they don't care either, because they all go to the Bahamas together for their vacations. The only people who really care about this stuff are people who are too busy and ignorant to know what's really going on. America doesn't matter. England doesn't matter. Spain doesn't matter. Any major company these days is multinational. They operate in a world beyond national tax rates, beyond national environmental regulations. It doesn't matter. And so I feel like the whole idea of national identity is essentially a scam being perpetrated on normal people by people who already know it's outdated. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah,
somewhere in there.
Yeah. What is the role of the media, news and entertainment, in both perpetuating culture of consumption and making people feel like everything that's happening these days is normal? Is it getting dark?
It's
You getting background noise?
no, it's just it's pretty dark. We can adjust to some degree, but also it's just how are you doing?
I'm all right. My throat's starting to get a little raw.
So there's like 3 questions left.
Okay. When television was starting out, I guess in the 40s, and the FCC was formed to regulate television, and they gave the airwaves, they gave these frequencies for transmission to different companies, networks. Part of the deal was that each of those networks would devote a segment of their time for the public good. It would be a non-profit, non-business driven news source. So you would have objective reporting that wasn't driven by ad revenue or any of the other considerations of business. That was part of the original deal, and over the years that deal has been whittled away and ignored. So now we have news that is purely driven by commercial considerations. When multinational corporations are paying for the production of your news, that's not news. That's entertainment that's being sponsored by corporations. It's not an objective source of information. And in America, everything is driven by business. Everything, if it doesn't make a buck, it disappears pretty much. And so, I think the journalism, a lot of journalists are trying to be objective, but it's very difficult when the company you work for is owned by the same company that owns, Disney or whatever. The idea of objectivity in reporting, I think, is antiquated and frankly silly at this point. And as far as entertainment goes, entertainment, what's the line? The breads and circuses keep the masses happy, right? So entertain us with our sports or gladiators, our UFC fighters or whatever, keep us distracted from what's really happening. And I think politics, as Frank Zappa said, is the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex. So even politics, which seems like a potential way to impact the trajectory of modern history, in the United States, it's a sideshow, right? It doesn't really matter who is elected to office. The lobbyists are controlling what happens in Washington. And until we get money out of politics in the US, it won't be anything more than entertainment.
What does the future look like if the world doesn't move away from what we're doing today, in nearly every sense? Mass consumerism, expanding population. Yes.
Well, I wrote an essay about this, about the near future for a German magazine a few years ago, and I remember having an image in my head of a river that comes to an island, and the river sort of bifurcates around the island, right? And so I feel like the flow of history is probably going to go in one of two directions. One is if this current trajectory continues, so we keep developing more and more technological fixes to the messes we're creating, in which case I think that we will continue to merge with technology and essentially experience a continuing diminishment of our humanity. And by humanity, I mean our essence as Homo sapiens, which is already happening. Our brains have already shrunk 10% since 30,000 years ago. Our physical bodies have atrophied. All of us, even athletes, would be considered pretty ridiculous to the average hunter-gatherer as far as physical fitness goes. We're much less healthy because of all the diseases we've talked about already. Half of us are walking around with artificial hips and knees and heart valves, and I've got fillings in my teeth and glasses and all sorts of technological patches over biological insufficiencies. I think that process will continue, and eventually we'll be brains encased in machines. And then as AI continues to develop, the brains won't be necessary anymore and we'll just be totally phased out. So that's one very cheery view of the future, that we're essentially a larval state for a technological life form that's being born out of us. On the other hand, if there is a major collapse, which seems at least as likely, and we find ourselves in a post-apocalyptic hellscape where 90% of the global population has been wiped out by wars or biological agents that got loose or who knows what. That's the bright side from my perspective. Massive destruction and death gives us a chance to do this over and possibly to do it right. Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, his great insight was that every culture's origin story is essentially the same story. It's the story of the prodigal son who goes out and searching for something out in the world, has all these adventures. You know, think of the Odyssey, it's sort of the prototypical story. And at the end of all these adventures, returns back to where he began and recognizes that what he was looking for was there all the time. He just didn't have the eyes to see it. And so my hope for humanity is that we have reached a point, and it does feel to me that we've reached a point in our trajectory where, almost like an orbit, where we're at the far end of the orbit, and now we start to circle back to where we came from. And maybe a tragedy isn't necessary. Maybe we actually have enough sense as a species to do this intentionally. But in any case, it does feel like we're circling back. If you look at advances in diet and exercise and medicine and psychology and sexuality and all these different areas, so much of the new thinking is a return to where we came from. It's looking, how do hunter-gatherers live? How did hunter-gatherers eat? What did they eat? How did they relate to each other? Because that's our natural state. And we're recognizing that the further we get from our natural state, the more trauma we inflict on ourselves and each other. So my hope is that we're returning back to where we came from, but in a spiraling sense. So there's a linear movement and a circular movement. So we're coming back around, but it's different this time because this time we've got solar energy capabilities. This time we understand geothermal. This time we have the technology to control population growth. We have the understanding to provide universal basic income, which removes one of the major incentives for people to have a lot of children in many parts of the world. And so we have the tools. If we had the sense to use them, we have the tools to create the world that we came from. And the great American poet T.S. Eliot, in the Four Quartets, said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to return to where we began and to know the place for the first time." So that's what I hope happens.
Are you optimistic?
No. No, because I don't see any evidence in the last 5,000 years of human history of masses of people doing the right thing. I see them doing the thing that conferred the most benefit to the most powerful among them in the short term. I think if people had any sense, Columbus and his crew, when they arrived in Hispaniola and saw how happy and generous and kind and healthy and beautiful those people were, they would have said, "Fuck Spain, we're staying here." I think that, every ship that came to the Americas would have just, burned the ship and stayed, and still given everyone smallpox, of course, but at least they wouldn't have raped and murdered. Yeah, no, I'm not optimistic, but I'm not really depressed because I'm at heart a nihilist. So it's like, we're fucked, but who cares? It's my slogan.
And on that note,
I think that's it.
Is that it?
Great.
that was fantastic.
Good.